Welcome and happy International Women's Day. I was mentioning to those here in person with us that we traditionally used to have before the pandemic events here at the Environment House early in the morning. It's a busy day with many activities in International Geneva to celebrate International Women's Day. And we took the habit to have those events early in the morning, and that was before the pandemic. And we are happy to be back in person and to be able also to celebrate in person women's and the environment here at the International Environment House. Just a few words to for who is online or who is also in the room. As usual, the video of this event, the summary, and any other information that has been mentioned, documents, etc., will be made available on the webpage of the event, and the link is being shared on the chat for who is online, or will be available on the screen for who is here with us at the International Environment House. And with no further delay, I would let you in the hands, if the expression is correct in English, I'm not sure, of Damaris Carnal, who is Switzerland focal point for the United Nations Environment Program. And she will be leading this event. Damaris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Diana. And let me first thank you and the Geneva Environment Network and team for setting an event with fantastic speakers. I'm really humbled to spend this morning, even if early, with you all and celebrate International Women's Day in such good company. As we know, this day is an important opportunity to celebrate and recognize the contribution of so many women and girls across the world who are acting to tackle the 3 planetary crises and making the place a better world and in harmony with nature. This day is also a moment to reflect on the progress and good practices, but also on the many challenges and obstacles women and girls are still facing. As we know, women and girls continue to be distinctly and disproportionately affected by the effects of the triple planetary crisis, and this is, of course, not acceptable. To address the issue and ensure gender equality, we need all hands on deck, and we will need to intervene in every area as needed. We also need to be better at conducting gender analysis and come up with gender-sensitive response based on data and monitoring tools. This will be important to make sure we don't exacerbate inequalities and discrimination. We'll hear more on this from our speakers. We also need to take more decisive action to ensure women are equal partner in decision-making processes, be it at the local, national, or international levels. This is not only an imperative to ensure gender equality, it is also the only way to tackle the challenges arising from the planetary crisis. We simply cannot ignore half of the planet. Each one of us have a role to play in that regard. I just want to highlight one issue is today, as you will probably have noticed, we don't have girls to share their expertise and insight with us. But of course, girls and young women are critical to our work, and we need to amplify their voice and listen to their messages and call for actions. We also need to make sure that they are safe and not disproportionately affected by the triple planetary crisis. One concrete way we think that we can do this is through the implementation of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And we will hear more from the special rapporteur in a bit. So even if girls are not here like on the panel, they are the future, and this is of course why we're doing this. It is therefore my pleasure to kickstart our discussion and to have Her Excellency Ambassador Tavita Levy to set the scene. She's the permanent representative of Samoa here in Geneva, and she will share her experience and insights, notably on the role of women in diplomacy, and also give her insights on how to bridge the gender gap. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Damaris. Taya Manuia, good morning, Talofa Lava, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, happy International Women's Day to all here in person and those joining us virtually. I am privileged to celebrate with you this morning an important day to acknowledge and recognize the contribution of women to all areas of sustainable development. The theme of the pathway for the development of Samoa is empowering communities, building resilience, and inspiring growth. The pathway focuses on people based on shared values of fairness, respect, inclusiveness, and responsibility, both for one another and our land and ocean resources. Christian principles and our Fa'asamoa culture and traditions underpin our way of life. We are a communal people taking collective responsibility for each other, our ainga and families, and the good of all in our villages, our communities, and country. We believe in shared prosperity, social equity, social security, and the sustainable use and protection of our natural resources. These values and customs have shaped our approach to development over the years in the face of growing economic, social, environmental challenges and the recent health pandemic. Samoa is a small island developing state in the heart of the Pacific Ocean. As such, the ocean is significant to our well-being, livelihoods, food security, resilience, and the sustainable development of our economy through fisheries and tourism. The Blue Pacific has the collective commitment to ensure that the security of our shared ocean geography, resources, and ecosystems therein, including from the impacts of climate change and disasters, as we are experiencing the rising sea levels, saltwater intrusion, crop damage, loss of fish stocks, intensifying frequency of king tides, and natural disasters. Recent extreme weather events in the Pacific region brings a sobering reminder of the vulnerability that small island developing countries face. As we've seen, Vanuatu has declared a national state of emergency yesterday, following the devastation caused by twin cyclones and earthquakes last week. The Samoa Policy for Gender Equality identifies 7 key strategic priorities, including the environment, with key outcomes to increase the visibility, contribution, and engagement of women and girls in agriculture, climate change, natural resource management, and disaster preparedness and response, especially those women and girls facing multiple and intersecting barriers and forms of discrimination. The same policy document acknowledges that there is relatively little gender analysis of climate change and calls for the need to strengthen the collection and disaggregation of data by sex and gender, and to ensure analysis is consistent with the gender transformative approach. Empowering women and girls to capitalize on the opportunities from technological advancements and bridging the digital gap can further support their participation from rural areas and remote islands in the climate change discourse. Women's role in our families, communities, and country as nurturers, homemakers, advisors, facilitators, mitigators, and leaders are foundational elements of agents of positive change. Samoa is one of 27 countries in the world with women as head of government or state. According to the 2020 statistics on women and leadership, and as remarked by the Honorable Fiame Naomi Mita'afa, Prime Minister of Samoa, at the recent Championing Women's Economic Equality Forum in New York on Monday, she was in the category of less than 7% of country leaders who are women. Samoa was the first Pacific Island country to ratify CEDAW in 1992. Our national leads on climate change and environmental negotiations are women, inspiring young girls and climate change champions and advocates. With 2 aspiring women diplomats at the Samoa mission, I am humbled to represent Samoa here in multilateral Geneva, and on this occasion this morning, celebrating the important contribution of women and girls to building a sustainable society. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and I will certainly not try to sum up what you said. I think every word you mentioned in your intervention were meaningful. Not a surprise, I think Samoa is leading by example, not only on environment and climate action, but also on gender equality. And we're very happy that you took the time also to be here with us for this event. And thanks also for highlighting the importance also of some challenges and what we need to do to make sure that we can truly achieve gender transformative action throughout. And to continue to set the scene this morning, I have also the pleasure to be here with UN Women and to welcome Mrs. Lubrani, who is the director of the UN Women Geneva office. And we very much look forward to hear from you on the importance of Women Day and also how we can capitalize action. So you have the floor.
Thank you so much. So first of all, my apologies. I went to the wrong, I have several events and I went to the wrong venue for another event. So my apologies. Ambassador Tavita Levy, I just want to say that listening to your words brings memory from my years in the Pacific. And indeed, I was personally dealing with those natural disasters that happened during the time that I was there in Vanuatu, Tropical Cyclone Pam and Tropical Cyclone Fiji in Winston in Fiji. And there were also extreme weather events in Samoa, but I also remember the leadership of your country in convening the small island states, all of the small island states for that first conference on the ocean. So, you know, there's so much leadership that has come, and indeed your country is also showing the way on gender equality and women's rights with the leadership that you are, fantastic leadership that you have in the country right now. But I'm delighted to join you all on this International Women's Day and really want to thank the organizers for this opportunity, and also very pleased to be here with Mr. David Boyd, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, who was going to share with us some of the recommendations from the last report on women, girls, and the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So indeed, the triple crisis of climate change, pollution, biodiversity loss, I would say is at risk of adding yet a fourth crisis, which is a crisis for the rights of women and girls, because all of these crises exacerbate gender inequalities and undermine women's, girls' rights to a clean, healthy, sustainable environment. And so what I think is important to remember today is that it's not just about listening to the women and girls' voices and understanding how those crises are affecting them, but also that we also have a duty to ensure that they are at the forefront of shaping solutions as decision makers, and that is so important, as we've just heard from the ambassador. We know that from various analyses and data that women and children are 14 times more likely than men to die or be injured from a natural disaster. And indeed, when I was leading humanitarian operations, that was what all of the data was showing when we did situation reports, that those who drowned, that those who were left behind were the women and the children. We also know that women make up 80% of the 21.5 million globally displaced every year by climate change-related events. And we know that displacement and forced migration are likely to rob women and girls from access to education. In Somalia, for example, when families had to migrate from rural to urban areas due to flooding, drought, or conflict, girls' enrollment rates dropped from 45% to 29%. And I was given the statistics that at the same time boys' enrollment after displacement rose, but then, which is a good thing, I think, but then why aren't the girls' enrollment also rising? I think we need to ask ourselves. Climate-induced disasters have shown to increase gender-based violence, as well as the disproportionate share of unpaid care and domestic work carried out by women. And we know that issues such as limited access or control over land, environmental goods, information, financial resources, all increase women's vulnerability. And also in many countries, and just this week I was in various events discussing the crises in places like Bangladesh, but also having come from Sudan recently. We know that destruction of livelihoods and exacerbated poverty resulting from these crises can also lead families to marry off young daughters both to have one less mouth to feed, but also because there's bride price involved, so it brings income. So this is just a tragic way of a coping mechanism for families. So on this International Day, I think as we speak, I speak of all of the problems. I think it's also very important to acknowledge and celebrate the amazing power of women and girls. And I would highlight particularly indigenous women who are leaders in environmental action, those who lead the way in sustainable management of natural resources, who defend the land, who preserve water in their communities. And their life is really anchored in that commitment and respect to protect diversity, using traditional knowledge and customary institutions to maintain and defend their lands. So I would conclude by saying that it's not only unjust to women, but I think it's also irrational and senseless to exclude women who are holders of knowledge and expertise from decision making towards addressing these enormous challenges of the triple crisis. So I think we end by recommitting today to doing more personally, professionally, and to advance forward solutions to address this triple crisis of climate change and environmental and biodiversity loss. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this, and we know that it's you know, for UN Women every day is Women Days, but we know that today you're extremely busy, so very happy that you were here. Thank you so much also for you know, reminding us some of the challenges and also some sobering numbers about the impact on the triple planetary crisis on women and girls. But also thank you for mentioning also the importance and the fact that we can all play a role, and this is not a fatality. We can change this. And finally, thanks also for highlighting the role of indigenous women. We need to value more their knowledge and make sure that we can learn from them and have their input embedded in our action. But this morning, to also deepen our reflection, we'll now have the privilege to hear from the Special Rapporteur, David Boyd, and we're very much looking forward to hearing more about your work, also your recent report, not only on the good practices in the recognitions of women's and girls' human rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. David, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Damaris, and thank you to the Geneva Environmental Network for organizing this event. Thank you all for coming. Happy International Women's Day, and it's just very actually humbling to be on a panel with so many brilliant women, and I think I can speak for Rolf. I say it's a bit daunting as well. You're right, Damaris, there aren't any girls on the panel. We had two terrific young women on our side event yesterday, one from Rwanda and one from Guatemala, and those of us who were there at that event, their words continue to resonate. And I should also say that this report on women, girls, and the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment was inspired by a young 17-year-old climate activist in Canada, who also happens to be my daughter. So her presence is always with her. In addition to being International Women's Day, we are celebrating this year the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in the first draft of that document back in 1948, it began with the words, "All men are born free and equal in rights and dignity. All men are born free and equal." And it was an Indian educator and activist by the name of Hansa Mehta who challenged that wording and said, we should change the language to say all human beings. And I think that's a really lovely anecdote to think about the role of women in the field of human rights. 75 years since the Universal Declaration, more than 4 decades since the international, the Convention to End All Forms of Discrimination Against Women came into force in 1981. And yet, sadly, systemic discrimination continues to persist in every state and in every sphere of society today, undermining women's and girls' ability to enjoy fully all of their human rights, including the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And it is because of discrimination and sociocultural norms, stereotypes, and biases that women and girls cannot realize their human rights. And so it's incumbent upon us to do really two things in the face of the triple planetary crisis: to tackle systemic discrimination and also to tackle the climate emergency, biodiversity loss, and pervasive pollution. And I loved hearing Ambassador Tavita Levy talk about the need for gender transformative actions, actions that change the norms, change the systems that perpetuate inequality and discrimination. And of course, as several colleagues have talked about, the triple planetary crisis is something that affects everyone, but not equally. So women and girls are systematically excluded from environmental decision making. They are unable to enjoy a fair share of the incredible benefits of nature, and they bear a disproportionate burden of the triple planetary crisis. Examples include the fact that, and this is really, it disturbs me every time I say this, but millions of women and girls die every year because of gendered cooking responsibilities that expose them to household air pollution from unclean fuels and inefficient cook stoves. We had an incredible testimony from this child from Rwanda yesterday about how many kilometers she has to walk every day with a jerry can to get water for her family's household needs. And in over 80% of the households around the world where water is not available on the premises, it falls on the shoulders of women and girls to do that task. My colleague from UN Women mentioned the fact that in climate disasters, 80% of the displaced people are women and girls. I mean, these are truly shocking statistics, and sometimes it's challenging to actually grasp the meaning of these numbers. So I think we should always aspire to try and put a human face on these statistics. So enough about the bad news. I want to talk about the good news as well. And I think I still get a kind of shiver down my spine when everybody mentions the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. The historic resolutions of the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly in 2021 and 2022, respectively, would not have happened but for the amazing contributions of women leaders. I think of the ambassadors from Costa Rica, Switzerland, Slovenia, the Maldives. I mean, just incredible leadership from women all around the world who pushed that forward. So we all owe a debt of gratitude there. But we also have incredible evidence that women and girls have been inspiring role models in terms of human rights defenders, in terms of environmental human rights defenders. We know that when women and girls are involved in the design and implementation of environmental policies and climate policies, we get better outcomes for everyone, whether that's women involved in water projects that lead to more efficient use of water, women involved in community forestry that lead to better biodiversity outcomes. We have evidence that there's a strong positive correlation between women in positions of political authority, as we see in Samoa, and lower carbon footprints, higher or stronger environmental standards, and higher levels of ratification of international environmental treaties. So really compelling evidence about the benefits of engaging women and girls and respecting their fundamental human rights. So the report we produced actually includes more than 200 good practices from 100 countries around the world in terms of implementing and recognizing women and girls' rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. I'll thank my colleague Stephanie Keane, who was an absolutely invaluable co-conspirator on that good practices annex to the report. And our report includes 4 categories of recommendations going forward that will enable us to tackle both systemic discrimination and the triple planetary crisis. And those categories include, first of all, empowering women and girls as environmental leaders by breaking down the barriers to their participation, by providing greater access to education. The second category involves empowering women and girls as economic actors, for example, by ensuring equal access to land and resources. We know that women and girls make up half the world's agricultural workforce, but women only own 20% of the world's land. So just incredible progress that we need to make. The third category of recommendations deal with providing additional resources to women and girls. So grassroots or grants for grassroots women and girls organizations, increasing the flow of finance and biodiversity, the flow of biodiversity and climate finance to women and girls, particularly for projects that they have been involved in the creation and design and implementation of. And then the final category of recommendations is really, in some ways, the most imminent and urgent, which is accelerating human rights-based and gender transformative action to tackle climate and environmental challenges. And that involves ensuring access to clean air, access to safe drinking water and sanitation, healthy and sustainably produced food, non-toxic environments, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, and of course, a safe, livable climate. And I don't want to take up too much time. It would be mortifying to be one of those men who talks on and on. But just to say that it's really critically important that we work together to achieve both gender equality and ecological sustainability. And I think that we have the capacity to do that in order to achieve the sustainable development goals, in order to achieve a just and sustainable future, in order to realize the right of every woman and girl to enjoy a safe, clean, and healthy environment. We have our work cut out for us, but we have examples of good practices, tremendous leadership, and I look forward to working with all of you to move this agenda forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and also, for all your work and advocacy. And of course, we know that, behind you, there's also a team, and we're also very grateful for your daughter to make sure that you will continue to fight the good fight for her, but also for girls around the world. We know the challenges. I think we need to continue to highlight, these numbers and put a face to these numbers, because this is a reality. But I was also very impressed by your report. And I think it's also a good way to show through good practices that, in fact, transformative environmental action focus on gender equality is possible and ongoing. And I think to highlight also the importance of role models will be important going forward. As we heard also from UN Women, it's not only the right things to do, the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do. And I think this is a message we need to continue to promote. To continue our discussion, we will now be privileged to hear more about the role of women and girls' action to address the triple planetary crisis. And for this, our first speaker will be Sonia, Director of the International Policy Center at IUCN. You have the floor.
Many thanks for having me today, and good morning to everyone. Gender equality is a human right and a prerequisite for sustainable development and for achieving IUCN's own mission of a just world that values and conserves nature. IUCN is committed to advancing gender equality, including through women's empowerment, as a union that understands the importance of equal opportunity and inclusion, and whose policies respect and promote diversity. We have worked closely with the secretariats of the Rio Conventions and other conventions as well to mainstream gender considerations into decision-making processes of these agreements and in developing their own respective gender plans of action. An important departure point for this discussion today, seems to me, as we celebrate International Women's Day, is to recognize that the loss of biodiversity is disproportionately felt by poorer communities, women and girls in particular, because of gender disparities. For example, a recent analysis by IAD argued that when resources become scarcer, women must spend more time and more energy making up for the shortfalls, much more than men, something that was already alluded to. So gender equality and women's empowerment are essential for the sustainable use of biodiversity. Understanding and exposing gender-differentiated biodiversity practices contributes to successful conservation and makes efforts more effective and efficient because women and vulnerable groups are empowered to participate as equals. Lamentably, gender inequality is ingrained in the existing social structures that manage and impact sustainable use, access to and control over biological resources, and the sharing of the benefits arising out of their use. And this is often unequal. Not only do conservation efforts exist in social structures that are inherently unequal, but also they do have a strong they do not have as strong as an impact if they are not designed and implemented with all the community members, including women and girls, in the decision-making process. So in the run-up to the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework adoption last year and the years before, IUCN actively advocated for a standalone target on gender equality. And we now have this target 23, which aims to ensure gender equality in the implementation of the new framework through a gender-responsive approach in which it is expressly recognized that women and girls have equal rights and access to land and natural resources. So we're very pleased about that. Now, the devil is in the details and how we're going to go about implementing that, right? We equally, as IUCN, called on the parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity to ensure that gender-responsive indicators were included throughout the monitoring and evaluation framework, aligned with each one of the targets that were being negotiated and are now adopted. This is important because we then know how to track progress against the targets that we set. In the same vein, we highlighted the need for a stronger and intentional language that would align and will build complementarity with both the CBD Gender Plan of Action, for instance, and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Again, something that is very important in terms of multilateralism, aligning different, frameworks so that they talk to one another, build to one another, and especially on gender mainstreaming, I think this is an essential prerequisite, let's say, for this for the effective work around advancing the gender cause. Colleagues, women use of biodiversity and natural resources is significant. In forest communities, for example, women can generate more than 50% of their income through the use of forest, compared to about 1/3 of men, and is therefore crucial for livelihoods and economic empowerment that also promotes sustainable use and conservation. So it is a fact, women's full and effective participation in conservation action makes a difference around the globe, but is often not documented or recognized. Let me point at some statistics. It is estimated that 47% of the work in the fishery sector on a global scale is provided by women. But the roles are often, again, undocumented by national statistics and databases. In Cambodia, for instance, it is estimated that women own 61.2% of the 500,000 or so micro, small, and medium enterprises. But we don't know about these things. We don't hear that much about these things. Community forestry groups in Nepal, with a high proportion of women in their executive committee, showed greater improvements in forest regeneration and canopy growth, despite receiving much smaller and degraded forest. So they did the homework well. They took care of the forest, and the results were good, right? So at a time when countries, especially those in the global south, are struggling with the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, there is an increasing recognition of the role of culture and gender in promoted inclusive development, eradicating poverty and advancing environmental sustainability. Gender matters for biodiversity conservation and sustainable use because women access different spaces, use different resources, and have different priorities compared to men. Due to women's marginalization from decision-making, conservation interventions are more likely to negatively impact them. For example, restrictions on seaweed harvesting in the Gulf of Mannar Biosphere Reserve in India, enforced since 2002, have undermined women's financial autonomy, exacerbating harm to those experiencing domestic violence, despite the fact that seaweed removal is likely benefiting conservation and the healthy coral reefs. So let me now turn to environmental and human rights defenders, as was already mentioned by David Boyd, including indigenous peoples and local communities, women and youth. As frontline defenders against environmental degradation, their activism contributes significantly to environmental and climate justice, biodiversity conservation, and equally establishes best practices for environmental conservation embodied through their cultural practices, traditional knowledge, and ways of life. So every day, environmental human rights defenders are confronted with numerous forms of repression. These are impacting their ability to engage in activism in a safe and efficient way. They are often the subject of intimidation, assault, unlawful detention, and other issues. According to a recent Global Witness report, at least 1,733 environmental human rights defenders have been killed over the last decade, with an escalating number of reported attacks over the last 3 to 4 years. And women and environmental human rights defenders are considered particularly vulnerable to the threats due to gender forms of violence, such as sexual violence, rape, psychological and emotional abuse, and attacks on their families. So historically, women environmental human rights defenders have been the front and center in advancing the rights of women, their communities, and those of their children, and contributing to policy discussions at regional and international level. The vulnerability of women involved in environmental activism underscores the importance of gender-specific responses to their safety and the protection needs. So IUCN has worked extensively to put, again, front and center the cause of women and girls in their pivotal role in conservation of this precious planet. And I invite you to consult the numerous resources that are available in our website and engage with us and with the experts at IUCN into furthering this conversation. I want to finish with some pictures to celebrate women and girls, their energy and power around the world today and every day. How do I do this? So from India, Hyderabad, this is a cooperative of women that dedicated their life to planting seedlings for rebuilding and reforesting forests nearby. These are women in cooperative in Morocco for argan oil extraction. Japanese women in Nagoya, a Chinese girl in Hainan, China. Northern Thailand, elder women are the ones that go and sell produce, the ones that take care, let's say, of their community's needs in terms of food production. And then the other two pictures are of schoolgirls in Hyderabad, again in India. And this last one is in Cartagena, my hometown in Colombia. A little girl that just seems to be flying after visiting a stall that I don't know if it was her mom or something that was taking care of the stall. And that's it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sonia, for your inspiring words and also for putting some pictures to illustrate what you were saying. I think it's very important what you mentioned on the importance of also documenting and having data on the contribution of women and girls. I think it's also the first step to also shift, what is it we value as a society, and the fact that often those key services that women and girls are doing for the community are undervalued, speak also about the systemic problem we have in our society, which also link to the challenges that we're facing concerning the triple planetary crisis. Thank you also for highlighting the importance of making sure that there are synergies among the different international instruments and that we go, they reinforce each other. Very well done for your work, also in making sure that we have now a target on the biodiversity framework. But we hear you, we need to make sure that this is not only word on paper. So I think all of us will need to make sure that it is important to track progress. And of course, lastly, I think to protect environmental and human rights defenders is of course key if we want to achieve progress on the triple planetary crisis and gender equality. Without protection, this will also not be possible. But to continue our discussion, and also not an easy topic, we'll now hear from Rolf Paye, who's the Executive Secretary of the BRS Conventions. Many challenges in that field also. We know that, for example, chemicals do not affect women in the same manner, and it will be important to understand how this is taken into account. And we're very much looking forward to learning more about the ongoing work in the BRS context. Rolf, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Damaris, and of course, a happy Women's Day to all of us, in fact, and not only the women. And here I'm saying with all the humbleness of being on this August panel with David and among such wonderful and really impressive women who have joined us this morning. I wanted to start by not saying all the right things, but sharing with you perhaps from a personal perspective, my discovery of what we're talking about here, because I think it's important to really understand that addressing the issue of women and girls is not just a matter of being academic and theoretical and thinking about all the data, but also a personal transformation. And I think that's very important in influencing the work that we do, and it influences the work that I do today. And here I'm not only referring to my grandmother, who I accompanied to carry water, and that was not so many years, and I'm not so old, right? To carry water from the river, because we didn't have piped water, but we seem to have forgotten all about this. We take it for granted. And of course, my mom, who was a teacher and who had a huge influence upon my life and my work ethic and my education. And of course, the many teachers that influenced me, they were mostly women, and I'm sure the situation is still the same. Even in Europe, I come from Seychelles, a very small island like Samoa, and women still play a very, very important role in education and in teaching. And I just wanted to highlight also one woman who actually influenced my journey into environment, and that was Dr. Mortimer. She came to Seychelles to study turtles conservation in Seychelles, and she's still in Seychelles, and a great friend, and we've been through many, many journeys together. And I went to this open lecture. I was 13 years old. Had aspirations like everybody. I was very interested in space. If one day they put me on a shuttle, I'm off to Mars, believe me. But she changed my whole perspective by this one lecture, and really influenced my career environment, which has until today. But my real discovery on the situation that we face today, and I just wanted to share this, is when I started designing the University of Seychelles, and that is designing a university in a very small country with 85,000 people at the time. Everybody said it was impossible. For me, it was providing young people with an opportunity for them to really develop. But I realized halfway, with analyzing all the data that I had in terms of education, in terms of jobs, in terms of aspirations, that the university will actually support the women of Seychelles. And what I found is, because Seychelles is a very maternal society, which means that the raising of children is very, very important, is that since we didn't have universities, only the men that actually left the home to travel outside of Seychelles to get an education. And as a consequence of this, it was only the men then who took very senior positions in businesses, in government, in the private sector. And suddenly I realized that with having a university in situ in the Seychelles, the women with the children could also go to university without being seen as abandoning the home. And through that, I mean, the university is now 12 years old, and I've seen so many of these women now taking very senior position in banking and even working outside of Seychelles. So for me, that's the greatest achievement personally. And to have this kind of revelation that sometimes the things we're talking about here, maybe it's visible, you know, we know the statistics, but many of these issues concerning women are actually invisible. And we have, sadly now, we've seen even in my country and other countries, the impact of domestic violence, and this is invisible, right? It's very cultural, and domestic violence doesn't leave the home, but how many millions of people suffer, not only in developing countries, but also very much so in developed countries. I listen to the news, even in Europe, of reports, and I've seen, you know, for example, I live in France. They're trying to put in laws now to protect against domestic violence because it's invisible and it's practically impossible. And here I'm not talking about only physical violence, but also psychological and emotional violence. So I just wanted to segue from this kind of invisible aspects into pollution, which is really invisible because, you know, we talk about climate change, talk about biodiversity, you can have great photos of these, but in the area that I work today, the impacts are very, very much invisible. And you only notice that many, many years later because these women have been exposed, whether they are working in agriculture, they've been exposed to pesticides, they look healthy, they look great, but when it comes to childbearing, you see the effects in the development of the child, you see the effects in their own development when they get older. But one thing I just wanted to ask the women is, what is the secret to long life? Because statistically, when women are given, you know, all the opportunities in society, they actually live longer than men. So this is a secret I would like to know if you can share with me. And of course, back to the issue of pollution, we see that many of these concerns are very much invisible. And I just want you to reflect on this during Women's Day so that we can start to really concretely address some of these issues. For example, in the toys that we buy, some of those have toxic chemicals where we expose our children. The cosmetics that women use, I love that you use a lot of cosmetics, right? But please, we need education to educate our girls, to educate our older women that your color is fantastic, ladies. Keep it. I enjoy my color. It changes from when in winter it gets a bit lighter, and in summer I get darker. It's something very important, but right now we have women, thousands and millions of women who are buying creams for skin lightening or for removing, and these have got toxic chemicals in those that actually have a huge impact on your health. So this is the kind of invisible aspects that I just want to point out this morning. And here I'm using just a few examples that we need to be aware of. And of course, there are very important cultural issues related to this that we need to address. And I'm very happy to have David here, and many of the things that I'm saying is also part of his report. And one of the things I wanted to highlight is the importance of strengthening regulations, standards, and policies in countries, whether it's from cosmetics, from toys, from exposure to these chemicals, to health and safety. You know, we have today thousands of women working in the textiles industry, for example. These women are exposed to the production of the clothes that we wear. And there I know women have a particular weakness to clothing and to, you know, having the thing. So again, I'm bringing this reflection to you as well for us to see how we can reduce consumption, because consumption creates a very, and I'm here, I'm not blaming the women, right? The men are also responsible, but I'm just saying that we need to jointly address the issue of consumption, because this is what creates the pollution, creates the, you know, how long we're making use of something that we buy and that we use it. We live in a society, especially in our society today, where we have disposable income and we have more income, and how we make use of that income in terms of production and consumption and how it impacts further down the line. And here I'm talking about, the people who are working in the front lines to supply the products that we use and we consume. And here I'm addressing, the whole society, the whole population, so that we can address from a sustainable perspective how we sustainably use our products, whether it's the clothes, the mobiles, the electronic products, but also the food wastage is also very important. And we have an important responsibility in ensuring that we make good use of these resources, because there are indeed women and children today, and this has been mentioned before, in those front line, in agriculture, in textiles, in food production, who are exposed to these chemicals, and our actions are actually not helping. So we should also be helping from that side and understanding the value chain of many of these products that we use. We also have, working, for example, speaking from the Minamata perspective here in the extraction of gold, using the use of mercury, and how many women and children are currently exposed to the mining of gold, and the demand for gold, not only as sources of investment, but for other uses as well. The Stockholm Convention deals with the issue of persistent organic pollutants, and we know that many of the products that we find today and that we're exposed today, whether it's from cleaning materials, from the things we wear, from the air we breathe, they've got toxic chemicals in those, and we need to be aware, and they are invisible. Ladies and gentlemen, sorry, I'm addressing everybody here again today, but I think it's important reflection on this International Day of Women, that we take this seriously, and we really work together to address those challenges of consumption and production. And I'm very happy in the VRA Secretariat we have over, I think, 70% women. It's really great to work with them, because they know and understand what's at stake, and that for me is something very, very important, because in the work that we do in the UN, or whether in the missions, we need to really understand what's at stake, because this is what drives us every day to make progress. We're not just doing things because we have to do it. We do it because we understand what's at stake. It's our women, it's our children who are growing up, that we need to have a better future for them, a toxic-free future for them. And this is what I'm calling, and I'm calling to you and to your heart today. It's a very impassioned request, not to the brain, but to the heart. And I know women understand that very, very well. I just wanted to give you a couple of examples. And in the Secretariat, we have a gender action plan, which we've had for many years. We have a gender focal point. Suzanne, who's sitting here with me, has the head of the organization. I also engage as a gender champion. And Suzanne knows very well, I pay a lot of attention to the Conference of the Parties and the role of women play in leadership roles. Today, I think for the first time in the history of the conventions, we have 2 women presidents and 1 man as the president. Forever, we've had, either 2 men or 3 men as our presidents, and this is beyond our control. Obviously, it's the countries and the member states that appoint. But it's something that I'm really proud that countries are seeing the valuable role that women can play in decision making, in leadership, in making change, and that for me is a significant progress. But we need to go further. We need to go deeper. We need to address this very core aspect, and this is part of my message this morning. This very core of us as human beings. Where do we place women, and how do we place women, and how we value them in the aspects of decision making, not because we have to do it right, but because of what's at stake and what's important for us to do. We have a lot of programs and projects. For example, To date, we've carried out 6 projects in Bolivia, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Nigeria, and recently in Kenya and Tunisia to improve our understanding of gender, because it's a very complex area. Even our understanding of gender, women, and plastics is still a big area of unknown for us. We're still trying to understand, the interfaces with this. And again, going back to my personal story, I used to go to those shops with my bag, with my mom or my grandmother, purchasing goods. And in those last 40 years, we've transformed the whole world. Now we use disposable plastics to get our things from the shop. This has happened in our lifetime, guys. We are the ones who are responsible for this transformation. We are responsible, and I'm sorry, we are, because it has happened during my time. Okay, during my time, and that's 55 this year. Can you imagine what has happened in 55 years? I just want to put this reflection to you. I used to go with my bag that I use, with a proper bag to buy things. Now today, I have to do recycling every weekend with the amount of plastic and packaging that I have to put away. So this is the reflection I need to leave with you today on International Women's Day. It's invisible. Let's try to make it visible. And it's, for me, a very important area of work. And thank you so much. Over to you, Damaris.
Thank you very much, Rolf, for sharing not only the work that is ongoing in the BRS context, but also some personal reflections. Also very happy that we have the gender focal point with us today. I think this is also an important role. Of course, and I think, all what you said is important, educating girls about the risk of chemicals contained in, product we use daily is, of course, important. We also, I think, need to do much better to make sure that those harmful chemicals are not allowed to be placed in the market also. And I think when we discuss about consumptions, we also, and you highlighted this, also need to tackle production. We know that we have unsustainable way of producing, and we cannot leave the responsibility only to the end of consumer. We also know what is at stake in terms of economical power, and I think this will need to be addressed. And thank you for also highlighting plastic and the challenges we're facing. I think the negotiation that are underway on the plastic treaty will have to address many of this. It's across the life cycle. It touches the 3 planetary crises. We need to also make sure that throughout this process, we'll make sure that we can also have this gender transformative action inbuilt in the treaty. And we know that even around this table, we have many people that will help us to make sure and we devise the right instrument and articles in the treaty. But now we're going to be very privileged to hear from Francesca, who's a longtime advocate of women and girls' rights, and who will share with us her perspective also on women and girls and climate crisis. So we're very happy to have you and looking forward. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Jen, for inviting me. I actually started my professional life in Geneva, in this very building, so it's really a pleasure to be here today. I work with the Center for International Environmental Law, so we really focus on the intersection between human rights and climate change. When we discuss the issue of women and girls' rights in the context of climate, I think we should start and take a step back and see what science tells us. Ms. Carnal, you mentioned the importance of data. So let's see what's the state of climate. We are in the midst of a climate emergency. We're seeing already devastating impacts on livelihoods, lives, ecosystems. And we know that adaptation has limits. So even if we stopped producing emissions today, which of course is not possible, still the impacts will be felt for decades and centuries to go. And there would be losses and damages that we cannot recover from. If we, again, look at the science, we know that we need to keep the temperature, the global average temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. If we go beyond this, we talk about overshoot, and I'm sure the colleague from the World Meteorological Organizations will talk more about it, but we know that if we go above this threshold, the world as we know it will be radically different, and we will trigger tipping points and loops that we cannot even completely foresee. So it's imperative that we stick to what science tells us. But at the same time, if we look at the current emission pathways, we see that they're way not on track. The current scenarios tell us that if we keep emitting as we are doing now, the global average temperature could rise up to 6 degrees. And if we look at the pledges that have been made now, the nationally determined contributions under the UNFCCC, which still are not respected, but if they were, again, they would be in line with a pathway of 2.5 or 3 degrees Celsius of temperature increase. So this is a very dooming scenario. And again, looking at data, the previous speakers already highlighted the differentiated impacts of disasters. Of course, looking at climate change, we need to differentiate between countries, but even within the same country, we need to look at gender, age, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, and so on, to really understand what are the impacts. Ambassador Tavita Levy mentioned the Cyclone Kevin in Vanuatu, and if we look, again, as has been shared by some of the speakers, what happens during disasters, women tend to have higher mortality rates. They tend to be more exposed to toxic waterborne diseases that have impacts on their sexual and reproductive health, for instance. But of course, in the aftermath of a disaster, we know that they're more prone to poverty. Fetching resources like water, as David was pointing out, is something that is a burden and it goes on women, and so that also exposes them to higher rates of violence and vulnerability. And if we look at the environmental democracy side, again, studies suggest that women are also one of the groups that are most discriminated. They tend to have less access to information, to participation in policymaking, and also to access to justice. And so all of these tells us that the core issue is discrimination and structural inequality. I really suggest reading the report of the Special Rapporteur on violence against women that really focused on environmental degradation and climate change and connected gender-based violence, structural inequalities and discrimination to the dire impacts of climate change that are felt by women. And this also tells us the importance of an intersectional approach, as has been, of course, alluded by many of the previous speakers, because gender-based discrimination often intersects with pre-existing forms of discrimination based on age, disabilities, ethnicities, religion, and so on. And in the context of climate change, the women and gender movement has been really at the forefront of pushing for an intersectional approach. Within the UNFCCC, the Climate Convention, we see that the women and gender constituency always incorporate the demands of other constituencies, such as indigenous peoples, youth, people with disabilities, trade unions, and so on. And this intersectional work was really key, for instance, when we were negotiating the Paris Agreement. Now the preamble, of course, says that parties should respect, protect, and promote and consider human rights. And these are a list of rights that was really achieved by all these constituencies coming together and fighting for the whole rights package. The preamble mentioned gender equality, empowerment of women, but unfortunately it doesn't refer to women's rights as such. So this is something I think worth considering. Looking again at the underlying cause of discrimination and the impacts of climate change on women and girls' rights, we shall not forget to look at the root causes of climate change. Today, we're talking about the triple planetary crisis. And if we look at biodiversity loss, climate change, pollution, we see a very worrying common thread. These are fossil fuels. We know, again, looking at data, that they are the core driver of climate change. 75% of emission globally are caused by fossil fuel production and and of course the impacts on reproductive health and children mortality. And again, if we look at a structural level, overall impoverishment that keep perpetuating discrimination cycles. And looking at the plastic side and fertilizers, we know that fossil fuels, of course, are a key component of them and are polluting ecosystems and our own bodies. David, together with the special rapporteur on toxic, did a very interesting work on sacrifice zones. So really, there's those areas where environmental degradation, pollution, social inequalities intersect with dire consequences, especially for women and children. And yet, on one hand, fossil fuels continue to be extracted and exported and used. And on the other hand, the nexus between fossil fuel and women's rights is not really made explicit enough. If we look at some of the states that really promote women's rights and gender equality at the national level and promote gender and feminist climate policies, that's, of course, imperative and very important, but we see that many of these countries are actually one of the leaders in terms of fossil fuel production and export. So really making a better nexus between fossil fuels and protection of women's rights would be imperative. There would be so many dimensions to cover, but I'm conscious of time. We touched upon environmental human rights defenders, also the participation of women in policy making. There's of course a structural issues of representation of women. When I go to the conferences of the UNFCCC, I'm always amazed at how many women negotiators are there, and some of the most vocal and fierce advocates, I must say, are women, and they keep inspiring me. Maybe some words on the role of Geneva in this context, also based on what CIEL, my organization, does. Definitely Geneva is a very interesting ecosystem for that, because of course it's the core of human rights institutions, but also the climate dimension is gaining more traction. We see that the Human Rights Council is doing more and more work, and it's also thanks to special rapporteurs that David and others that really the climate and human rights nexus is being further understood and looked at. And of course, treaty bodies have a very important role to play. We have the CEDAW, the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, that is doing very important work. They prepared a general comment on women's rights in the context of disasters, including in the context of climate change, but also in their state review process, we see that they are doing, making more and more recommendations to state parties about their duty to really reduce emissions if they want to effectively protect and promote and respect women's rights, and also tackling fossil fuels. So that's very interesting work and worth following. In terms of civil society, we are part of the GECO, the Geneva Climate Change Consultation Group. This is an informal group of NGOs working at the intersection of human rights and climate change. We don't focus only on, of course, women and girls' rights and gender, but we really push for an intersectional approach. So really making sure that every time human rights institutions and non-human rights institutions discuss climate, it is acknowledged that a human rights-based approach to climate action is needed. Because on one hand, we need to ensure that we protect people from the impacts of climate change, but we also want to ensure that the activities and the measures that are put in place to address climate change do not affect, do not endanger human rights, but actually can contribute to tackle inequalities and further promote rights. Also, the timing of this event is quite interesting because next week there will be the session of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It will be the final step of a process that has led to many reports over the years. And the negotiators will be adopting the summary for policymakers that will guide state action in terms of climate change for the years to come, and will also inform the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So it will be very important to see to what extent human rights, and in particular women's and girls' rights, will be captured in the summary for policymakers. The IPCC has acknowledged already that indigenous peoples, women's, elderly, minority groups are the most exposed, but it will be really important that this political document also outlines that, and perhaps Jen can host a briefing to take stock of this important outcome. Thank you so much again.
Thank you so much, Francesca, and thank you also for all the work you're doing, you yourself and your organization. I think it's also thanks to people like you that we make sure that we don't stay in our comfort zone and that you push us to do more. And this is, of course, very important. I also think, and you mentioned Geneva, I think this is also why we think it's so important, is we need to build synergies, we need to work across silos, and I think you're doing this brilliantly, also highlighting that human rights, gender, climate, all of this is interrelated, and we won't address one issue without tackling the other. And if we do this smartly, we can also have positive and spillover effects. I think it's very important what you said about discrimination and structural inequalities. We know that, and we see this more and more, that what we see in terms of gender-based violence are also the kind of same systemic trigger that have also led us to where we are on environmental and climate. And well taken on the need to further deepen our thought on the nexus of fossil fuels and gender policies. And now, but certainly not least, we'll hear from Jana Gevorgian, Director of the Group on Earth Observation Secretariat, GEO. And I think it was already raised many times. We need data, we need a partnership, and we very much look forward to hearing more on this topic and share with us. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Damaris, and good morning to everyone. Happy International Women's Day to us all. It's really a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. It's so nice to spend the morning with the neighbors here in Geneva town. I think I'm still fairly new to the Geneva scene. I took up my position in July 2021, and even though it's 2 years, I think, coming out of the lockdown, it feels like it was just yesterday. And I realize how many new acquaintances and friendships I have yet to make just in Geneva alone. And hearing from all of you and your individual perspectives, which your missions bring to this topic, is mind-blowing. It's just clear that the scale of the inequality crisis is just staggering, truly, and it's just seen on so many levels, in so many aspects. And it's further really saddening and tragic that while the international community does indeed, with good intentions, try to make progress and does quite a bit to advance against our goals, we also, the human population, love to undo much of that progress through human conflicts, through preventable events, truly. And Rolf was speaking about the sort of the extractive economy and the crisis it creates in terms of pollution. Just yesterday, news broke out that in one of the largest cities in India, Cochin, actually hometown of my husband's family, landfill mountain caught on fire. And so now it's just emitting enormous amount of methane, undoing of progress that the country was really doing in actually reducing the emissions. 600,000 people, like almost 1 million, have been told to try to stay home. And it just happened because of our consumption practices, as Rafael pointed. But I'm not going to talk about the doom and gloom. I'm going to try to talk about how, in fact, data does, and Earth observation in particular, does have a role to play in driving transformative change and helping tackle this triple planetary crisis. So Group on Earth Observation represents a global partnership that, as the name suggests, observes the Earth. And we do that from space, from atmosphere, from the surface of the planet, also from underwater using satellites, drones, underwater vehicles, and citizens who actually do get engaged with observation of the Earth. With the theme of today, I think I'd like to point out a few ways in which data really influences transformative change. I'm going to use a few slides. And I'll start by talking about how data illuminates. We're all familiar with the phrase, you can't manage what you can't measure, but you really can't measure what you can't see. And that's where being able to see things on the ground, knowing that there is an issue that requires a solution, becomes paramount. We think data exists universally. We think, perhaps we think, that in today's age, when truly there is so much amount of data that's generated, we shouldn't really have dark spots on the Earth. We should have information about every spot on Earth, but it's really not quite so. And as the community of youth mappers would say, if you're not mapped, pretty much don't exist. People don't get to know you have problems with access to basic amenities. I'm going to let the youth mappers speak about that, and I'll share the stage with them through this 1-minute video. And I hope you will get interested and find their full 25-minute film that talks about how the youth mappers are putting themselves on the map.
When you can't see a problem, you can't address it. So being unmapped can mean you don't exist.
These communities that are not on the map are left out in developmental strides. So it's quite a scary thing for communities not to be on the map.
What we wanted to do was create data for the world by having young people and university students at the core of the mapping project. We are engaging residents and students who live there into the solution.
The beauty of youth mappers is it is not restrictive of one's background.
As a woman, I felt that it has given me a voice to speak.
They are contributing to bringing the world to a global village.
I get to collaborate with my fellow youths around the world for a common purpose.
We don't just need maps, we need mappers.
It's really a teaser for a really inspirational video. But you know what I love about it is the engagement of the young people in this project, because we know that really to achieve transformative, we need to build that capacity starting with their initiatives such as the Giga project between ITU and UNICEF, really that aims to connect every child in the world, go a long way to allowing the illumination of every spot in the world. But again, we're still far, far, far away from being able to know about every child who lives on the earth, who may not be able to access education because there is no electricity. So to be able to create partnerships with the likes of ITU, with the likes of sustainable energy, the likes of IRENA, in order to tackle this crisis of just lifting the fog, shining the light on the places where people live, is a massive challenge, but one that I think, again, we have the community, we have the institutions in place, and it will take these kinds of robust partnerships to really illuminate. I heard people use words like speaking and appealing to the hearts of people, minds of people. Data by itself, indeed, can seem dry, rigid. Sometimes people don't actually like to read the data because data doesn't always tell a good story. Data could tell that we're falling short of achieving our goals. So how do we make sure that people care about the data that we put out there? One way is truly to try to connect it to the hearts and minds of people. That can only happen if people understand that data in their local, national context, to be able to connect it to their own environment through education. That I'm in charge of the slides. So I would say that data also educates, but the best way to really go about this education is through inclusive participation of people, even in data gathering. On this slide, for instance, is a shot from an activity that was run in the US. It's been going on for years, and it's community mapping of urban heat islands in the United States, this might be shocking. It was for me when I first learned about it, but extreme heat is the #1 weather-related killer. In a country like the US, where you think you have all the cooling and air conditioning and everything, but it's the #1 extreme weather killer in the US. And so what my former agency, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, has been doing with the engagement of local communities was to put them on the streets in their own neighborhoods and map those urban heat islands. As a result of those maps that you can see, the local municipalities, local community leaders are able then to make informed decisions about their urban design, about where to install cooling stations, about where the vulnerable populations live, and actually predict the resources that may be needed in hospitals, in emergency services, when those extreme events happen. We're drawing inspiration on work such as this and are currently within Group on Earth Observation developing a global project with WHO and WMO to create a global heat and health service. Extreme heat is a huge risk to women everywhere, even to be able to bring their pregnancy to full term and deliver healthy babies. So by ensuring that major cities and human settlements around the world can have access to accurate information, predictive information about extreme heat, we can actually help them to plan smartly and in an informed way to protect their population. So speaking of protect, data does protect. We speak here of the triple planetary crisis. Climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, but the three are very much interconnected. Our governments have recognized for a long time the crisis we're dealing with respect to environment and ecology, and they've been addressing it through the various conventions and treaties. I'm not the one to tell you how many MEAs there are. I think I've heard the number like 500 or so. That's pretty staggering number as well. And each of these is actually served by different science communities. Let's just take, UNFCCC. It receives science from IPCC. Let's take the biodiversity community, science from IPBET. One thing we're really hearing and responding to is the realization of even the fragmentation within this environmental governance system. If every convention is going to receive one type of science from different types of organizations, then who is going to truly try to create sort of uniformity around the information on which then the negotiations and the implementation of these various treaties can take place? And GEO sees a role for ourselves in that, in order to leverage the observations of the Earth. And if we think about the Earth is very much an integrated system. So we see no borders, there are no silos. All of the Earth systems, they are interacting all the time. And so we want to bring the nature of the Earth observation to be one of those solutions to creating one common authoritative framework for providing critical information that the various Rio conventions and others can use to set targets, to monitor progress, to identify hotspots. And this service really will go beyond just serving the conventions, but also the finance sector that is increasingly leaning into sort of reporting on their climate risks and biodiversity risks. So we want to make sure that the results of these actions, whether it is making investments in various locations, or whether it is monitoring the efficacy of the policy actions taken, they are actually comparable. So providing that source of reliable, uniform information is something that we're excited to kick off with a global ecosystems atlas that will integrate all existing products that exist on ecosystems and biodiversity into a single place. You may be shocked if I tell you that that for wetlands alone, as we were speaking with the Ramsar Convention secretaries, with Wetlands alone, there are over 30 wetlands monitoring products out there. Community has been hard at work for decades to map all kinds of wetlands, but the countries still don't actually have information to build their wetlands inventories. So it's not for the lack of data, but it is for the lack of collaboration. So this issue of integration is actually, it may sound simple, but it's extremely challenging when you think about the need not only to integrate different data sources, different platforms, different approaches, but the hardest is probably in integrating different communities and networks of people. Somehow we people tend to be quite protective of our own domains and of our own operational environments. I've included on the slide up on top, if actually we go from the right to the left, just to demonstrate interconnectedness of the crisis that we are talking about. If we look at, I should have probably planned this a little bit better, but count the third picture in the top row from the left. Those are the images of Aral Sea, which in 1950, it was the fourth largest inland lake in the world. And it was 67,000 square kilometers. Just so you can imagine, the Geneva Lake is 580 square kilometers. That was 67,000. I grew up in the former Soviet Union country, Armenia, and when I was in a geography class, they would always call on us to point to various places of the world. And if anyone asked where, point to Aral Sea, it was the easiest thing because it was a big body of water. Over time, you can see in the lower that quadrant there, this massive lake has shrunk to its 1/10. What happened there? It used to be a robust ecosystem. It used to provide livelihood and economic services to the communities. It was rich with fish. It was a rich agricultural region. And then what happened? Water division, over extraction, that was not managed. And we ended up with pretty much just the lake bed. And the plumes, the dust plumes that are now transmitting chemicals and toxics or plumes affecting public health and driving the communities away from that region are the real result of human activity and poor management of the ecosystems. One may think, well, okay, well, that's a really sad case. Why should we care? Because as the World Wildlife Fund report done jointly with Maxar satellite company says, if you imagine ecosystems, and we are in Switzerland, it's like a watch mechanism. All the multiple cogs really kind of make each other work in a perfect sort of mechanism. And when one cog breaks, all others also can't really operate. So ruining one ecosystem creates that kind of a chain reaction. And if anything, our data allows us to learn from the past and plan better for the future. And I will conclude with what else data does, and that is that the data empowers. And participation of women and girls, especially early and mid-career professionals, has been a key driver for inclusive tackling of the crisis and also tackling of ecological and gender crises. And I have to give a shout out to the communities such as Women Geospatial, Ladies of Landsat, Sisters of SAR, who have created these powerful networks without any political will and backing. It was purely driven by the joint need of sisterhood. And now they've grown into communities of 5, 6, 10,000 of professionals who are constantly on the daily basis supporting one another and really are there to carry on the good fight, as Damaris, I think, put it at one point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan, and sorry to rush you. We're already a bit over time, but I can assure you that the importance of data and science is dear to our heart and also to the work of the Gen. So there will be plenty of other opportunities, I think, to engage, and I think this will also be key to inform our work. Thanks also for the teaser. We'll certainly have also the resources put up on the Gen website so that people can look further. We're arriving at the end of this event, which of course is only an event, but we have embarked on this journey, and I hope you will be, encouraged to about what you have heard and inspired to take more action. Before giving the last word to Sylvie Motta, who is the acting director of the Europe office here in Geneva, I just wanted to give an opportunity to Ambassador Tavita Levy, who opened our discussion today so brilliantly, if she wanted to share a last reflection, and then I will get to Sylvie.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to reflect. Only to say thank you very much for organizing this very informative session. I myself have learned from across the table, but one takeaway that from this morning would be the importance of working together. We've seen the cross-cutting impact of human action on the environment. For small countries represented here in Geneva, it's such a big step. Samoa opened its mission 10 months ago. I've been here 10 months to open the mission, and we look forward to working with each and every one of you to use data to reveal, illuminate, to make the invisible visible of our society. And
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and we're very happy that you have joined our in Geneva. The last word, Sylvie, to you, and also, of course, we know how UNEP is also leading the way on this issue. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Damaris, and I would like to thank everyone, the panelists and the Geneva Environment Network, everyone online and in presence in this room, for very interesting listening to the various contributions. That was, again, very rich enlightenment on many points of view, which actually prompted me to jump back in time, hence my gray hair. But if you put together major environmental and women's rights movements, you go back to the 70s, where it all started. 72, Stockholm Conference on Human Environment, 75, the first women UN, and the two culminating events in my lifetime, that is 92, the Rio Conference, and 95, the Beijing Conference on women's rights. What I see in my little, say, professional life is that we moved from, let's say, a bit of a static comprehension of women's rights as human rights, all the way now as women as drivers and leaders for action. And I think this evolution, which I've witnessed in my life, is particularly interesting. Though looking at the environment and looking at situation, maybe there is a lot more to do. But let me go back to the International Women's Day of today, and this year is under the theme Digital Innovation and Technology for Gender Equality. And the link the Gen event is making now with women, girls, and the triple planetary crisis is particularly interesting in that context. I will not linger on too much on what UNEP is doing, but through tackling the planetary crisis, we are looking at enablers, meaning looking at how we can indeed shift, for instance, investments towards sustainable development, looking at mechanism, looking at policy, data sets, and the use of data, but we're also looking at digital transformations. And digital transformation is perceived as an enabler for awareness and also for action. So as Jana said, this data is the opportunity to provide real-time information on the state of the environment, around ourselves. And those data are key to support our action to fight the triple crisis. But as we focus on the role of women and girls, we have unfortunately that women are not equally empowered when it comes to transformation. There is an enormous gap, geographic and also gender gap, into access and use of digital tools to have access to the necessary data. But there is also an enormous gap when it comes to education. We all know in our Western developed society, as well as in developing countries, that access to science education, to mathematics education, to the hardcore education is not privileging women. So education is probably the next very, very big challenge to promote women for education. But I think I will simply end on that note because a lot has been said, but looking forward and looking into the future, we are at a tipping point where indeed transformative changes are absolutely needed. And women are fully actors, but also probably inspirational source for all of us. So looking at experience like shared by many panelists around the table is probably something very, I will end on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And, let me just conclude by wishing us all a very happy International Women's Day and by giving a round of applause to all our panelists, to the Gen team and everyone online and up.